Blanton-Stroud. I'm the author of the recently published novel, Copy Boy, out of She Writes Press, just about 5 weeks old. I'm going to be your moderator for this panel on the literature of resilience. I am so pleased to be a part of this conversation. While I was writing my novel, which is set in the Depression era, I made many trips to the National Steinbeck Center, and I have always had an affinity for this museum and its mission. I grew up in Bakersfield, California, the daughter of Dust Bowl immigrants who lived in federal work camps, actually the ones described by John Steinbeck in Grapes of Wrath. My novel features the lives of Okie field workers who are trying to regain what they lost in the Depression exodus out of the Great Plains. I also teach college writing at Sacramento State University, where for the past decade, one of the themes I've had my students research and write on is the topic of grit and resilience. And so naturally, when it turned out that I would have the opportunity to join you for a conversation on this theme in Steinbeck and other artists of that time period, I jumped at the chance. So what I'd like to do now is to ask the other panelists, all of whom are authors published by She Writes Press, to introduce themselves and their work briefly. And why don't we start with Ashley?
Great, thanks so much, Shelley, and thanks so much for joining us in this panel. Really looking forward to the next hour with all of you. I'm a native New Yorker. I moved west after I graduated from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts in 1979, and I served as a VISTA volunteer in both Oregon and Washington before embarking on a long career in both journalism and education. I've been writing now full-time for 8 years. I published my first novel, Eliza Waite, in 2016, and that centers around an enterprising woman in Skagway, Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush. And then my newest book that's just been out 2 months now, Answer Creek, centers on the Donner Party. And I'll be talking quite a bit about the Donner Party during this panel discussion and how the role of resilience played into their journey.
Wonderful. So let's turn next to Myra, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm really happy to be on this panel with all of you. Thanks for having me. I am also a native New Yorker like Ashley, and I came out to California to go to UC Berkeley and ended up, my first career was as an organic farmer, and my husband and I started Earthbound Farm on 2 acres in Carmel Valley, and we were actually the first people to successfully package salads for retail sale, and our company grew to be the largest grower of organic produce in the world. And part of our origin story is that my dad, who is a Holocaust survivor, this is his photo when he was a young man, was a brilliant inventor, and he had just retired, and he figured out how to create all the equipment that we use to package salads with things that he got from the junkyard. And he was an incredible person. He died in 2012 when I found an unpublished manuscript written about his life and his healing journey. And I spent 4 years researching and completing his story, and my book just came out in April.
Thank you, Myra. And now let's turn to Gretchen.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm Gretchen Charrington. My book is Poetic License, and it's a memoir that's coming out on Tuesday. It traces the arc of the relationship that I had with my complicated father, the poet, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Richard Eberhart. It's grounded in the 1990s when I was researching in his literary archives at Dartmouth College to better understand who he was, both to me and to the public. And I was really facing an existential crisis between the family myths that I had lived with for 20 years and my growing up years, and also my own lived experience of my dad. So I was very fortunate to grow up in a literary swirl of famous writers, but I was kind of on the periphery of that swirl. And at the same time, as an adult, I was building a career advising CEOs on how to face truths in their own companies. So that really sets the conflict, if you will, for the story that I've written. Thank you so much for having me and being here.
In order to ground our conversation in John Steinbeck, we decided to look first of all at a very short passage out of The Grapes of Wrath. And so this is chapter 3, a portion of chapter 3 in The Grapes of Wrath, and it's the famous kind of turtle parable. And I'm going to read just a bit of it, and then we're going to turn to the panelists to ask them what message or idea or detail they get from this famous passage that will start us in our conversation about resilience and grit. At last, he started to climb the embankment. Front clawed feet reached forward but did not touch. The hind feet kicked his shell along, and it scraped on the grass and on the gravel. As the embankment grew steeper and steeper, the more frantic were the efforts of the land turtle. Pushing hind legs strained and slipped, boosting the shell along, and the horny head protruded as far as the neck could stretch. Little by little, the shell slid up the embankment until at last a parapet cut straight across its line of march, the shoulder of the road, a concrete wall 4 inches high. As though they worked independently, the hind legs pushed the shell against the wall. The head upraised and peered over the wall to the broad, smooth plain of cement. Now the hands, braced on top of the wall, strained and lifted, and the shell came up slowly and rested its front end on the wall. For a moment, the turtle rested. A red ant ran into the shell, into the soft skin under inside the shell, and suddenly head and legs snapped in, and the armored tail clamped in sideways. The red ant was crushed between body and legs, and one head of wild oats was clamped into the shell by a front leg. For a long moment, the turtle lay still, and then the neck crept out, and the old humorous frowning eyes looked about, and the legs and tail came out again. The back legs went to work, straining like elephant legs, and the shell tipped to an angle so that the front legs could not reach the level cement plane. But higher and higher the hind legs boosted it, until at last the center of balance was reached. The front tipped down. The front legs scratched at the pavement, and it was up. But the head of wild oats was held by its stem around the front legs. Now the going was easy, and all the legs worked, and the shell boosted along, waggling from side to side. A sedan, driven by a 40-year-old woman, approached. She saw the turtle and swung to the right, off the highway. The wheels screamed, and a cloud of dust boiled up. 2 wheels lifted for a moment and then settled. The car skidded back onto the road and went on, but more slowly. The turtle had jerked into its shell, but now it hurried on, for the highway was burning hot. And now a light truck approached, and as it came near, the driver saw the turtle and swerved to hit it. His front wheel struck the edge of the shell, flipped the turtle like a tiddlywink, spun it like a coin, and rolled it off the highway. The truck went back to its course along the right side. Lying on its back, the turtle was tight in its shell for a long time. But at last its legs waved in the air, reaching for something to pull it over. Its front foot caught a piece of quartz, and little by little the shell pulled over and flopped upright. The wild oat head fell out, and 3 of the spearhead seeds stuck in the ground. And as the turtle crawled on down the embankment, its shell dragged dirt over the seeds. The turtle entered a dust road and jerked itself along, drawing a wavy, shallow trench in the dust with its shell. The old humorous eyes looked ahead, and the horny beak opened a little. Okay, so question number 1. We'll go first to Ashley. on this question. Can you share something you noticed in this turtle scene in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath on the topic of resilience and grit?
Steinbeck is so good, isn't he?
There you go.
I love his fair language. In reading this passage and then thinking about the Donner Party especially, if we adhere to the premise that resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty, the turtle's resilience is tried in rapid succession 4 times. First, as he climbs up the embankment of the hill, then with the parapet, the concrete wall that he needs to lug himself over, then swinging away from the sedan, then being hit by the truck that swerves to hit him. So 4 times in rapid succession, the turtle is faced with adversity. There's something called the resilience theory model that I found out about when I was preparing for this panel. And psychologists say it's not the nature of the adversity that is most important, it is how we deal with it. And so like the turtle, we and our characters, for those of us who write fiction, we have an array of choices of how we deal with hardship. And it boils down to 2 diametrically opposed options. And that is, are we going to give up or are we going to go on? Those are basically the 2 options that we have. And we think about bouncing back. Resilience in the Latin is called springing back. So bouncing back is a good translation of that. We think of people who bounce back from, say, one incident, an accident or a death or a broken relationship or a job loss, something along those lines. But again, the turtle bounced back 4 times in a perhaps time period of 5, 10, 15 minutes. So there's a risk in any journey. This is what I came up with. There's a risk in any journey, whether it's crossing a highway or crossing a continent. And the Donner Party, which again, I'll talk about more, they faced a series of adversities that compounded the difficulty of their journey. But they faced and dealt with one obstacle at a time, and they kept a long view. I think that was key for both the turtle and for the Donner Party, to keep a long view of their goal as they were trekking along.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's go to Myra next. What did you notice, Myra, in the scene with the turtle?
Yeah, it's interesting because Ashley was talking about taking the long view, and I was thinking about my father, who survived 3 years in 7 different slave labor concentration camps during World War II. And I was thinking that I'm just guessing, but I feel my dad was a little more like the turtle, where it was one movement at a time, reacting to the moment, surviving 1 minute after the other, surviving 1,000 days. And I think for my dad, or anyone in that situation, when it's all about survival, when you are on the edge of death, of destruction, that it is staying in the moment, doing everything that you can to respond to the moment. And so that's what I was really thinking about. I mean, my dad was taken away in 1942 with 40 boys from his village, 40 teenagers and young men, and he was the only one that survived. And so I've thought of what it must have been like, and I do feel a little bit like when we describe this turtle, that was how my dad crawled through those 1,000 days.
Let's turn to Gretchen now. What was your response to the turtle?
Well, first of all, I just was so moved by the turtle, as Ashley mentioned, to face that much hardship all in a kind of short period of time. And I think what really struck me was the image of the turtle on its back, with its after the car hits it, and the turtle is splayed out on its back. It doesn't know, in a way, up from down. It's lost all of its clear bearings, in a sense, in its world. And I think, as Ashley said, there are sort of ultimately there's a binary choice. It's either we go on or we don't go on. In this case, the turtle was making the survival tactic, to flail around with his legs until he hit a small piece of quartz that allowed him to get a little grip and be able to flip himself over, which I don't know whether this is anthropomorphizing or not, but the turtle probably has happened. That's probably happened before to the turtle, that it's been flipped over and it's needed to figure out how to flip itself back. But in any case, so it may have been very instinctual that it did that, but it just struck me that I think most of us have probably had moments in our life where we felt kind of splayed out on our back, because of some particular challenge or obstruction that was placed in our way, or that we placed in our own way. So that's what really reminded me of.
Thank you, Gretchen. Kat, you've asked a question that we're going to be coming to in just a few minutes. So thank you for that segue. I want to also say, since Gretchen mentioned that she's especially touched by the turtle landing on his back and being stuck there, not only is Gretchen launching her book in 2 days, but she had back surgery 2 days ago. So I think the metaphor is not just figurative, I think it's quite literal. All right, we'll stick with you, Gretchen, for the next question. What did you discover about grit or resilience during the process of researching or writing your book?
So my book was started in the 90s and took almost 20 years for me to complete. So a full 2 decades of my life, through my 40s and 50s, and really into my 60s, was spent finishing this book. And I think, to me, there were many opportunities for me to have given up. I can think of a number of occasions where I gave up momentarily, where I'd sort of had it, threw down the manuscript, said, I'm done with this. I'm going to go have fun in my life instead of trying to figure all these things out about me and my dad. But there was something in there that kept me going. And I think that was, I like to think of it humbly as a little light beam or something. There's a little shot of light inside that helped me remember at times when I sometimes forgot myself that I did have a story to tell, and that I had the long goal of publishing this book. I'd had that vision for a long time, and I would just need to, kick my legs around until I found my footing again. And so, to me, as I proceeded through writing the book, having had to learn how to give up kind of business writing, which is really different than creative writing. So I had to relearn the creative writing side of myself. I was rejected by over 20 publishers, traditionals, and universities. I had plenty of times, like I said, to give up, but I kept going. And in the process of that, it made me interested in looking into the research on resilience and grit, in your term. And I learned some important things from that research, one of which is that there are some protective measures, which probably most of us are born with, and many of us are privileged to have supportive parents and friends, general optimistic view of the world, which I think I do, a fairly easy temperament. Some might argue otherwise occasionally, but a fairly easy temperament. And also a lot of positive childhood experiences where I was able to overcome challenges and sort of get back on my feet. So I had those. Those are protective measures. But then during a crisis, what's really needed is trustworthy information and personal advocates. And those are the two things that I was struggling with in my 40s. Trustworthy information. I'd been trusting my own information for a long time. And at least in the beginning, I didn't believe that there were any personal advocates for my story. I I proved myself wrong with that clearly over time. So I do think that the process of writing my book and what it engendered in me in terms of interest in this particular issue really came through.
Thank you, Gretchen. Ashley, how about you?
Well, unlike Gretchen and Myra, I'm not writing a memoir, which I'm sure many people in my life are breathing a sigh of relief about. But I'm committed to writing stories of underserved women, women's voices, fictional women's voices, who are mosaics of many other women's voices in the American West. And when I thought about taking on a trail story, I had to challenge myself. Would I take on the most iconic trail story in American history? And so I felt like if I was going to devote 4 years of my life, which it takes to write historical fiction, each novel takes about 4 years, I was going to take on the biggest story. And there are few sagas in American history that rival the Donner Party. It was 1846, for those of you who need a little bit of a refresher, when a small group of ordinary people, farmers and businessmen and their families, struck out from the East and Middle America and left Independence, Missouri in large wagon trains heading west on a series of trails. And every day, the emigrants were forced to deal with tangible challenges. They had weather, geography, time and distance, hunt for water and food and grass and game. So every day they had challenges. And I mean, let alone the underlying intangible challenges that a lot of women had to face, like patriarchy and misogyny and xenophobia and domestic violence and racism. Those are the intangible challenges that a lot of women had to face. But for the first half of their 2,000-mile journey, their obstacles were not insurmountable. They bounced back from bouts of bad weather and unforgiving territory and lack of resources. But like the turtle, they had a tipping point. And I picture the turtle on its back as the Donner Party is crossing the Continental Divide on July 18th of 1846 in present-day South Pass, Wyoming. They're 2.5 months from leaving Independence, and they're 2.5 months from reaching Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. It's they're halfway. And it's also a great physical barrier, the Continental Divide. There was no going back after they crossed the Continental Divide. So after this point of no return, that's when their chain of failures really intensified. And most historians agree that the Donner Party's fatal flaw was accepting the advice of a con man, Lansford Hastings, to take a shortcut across the Great Salt Desert, which cost them lives and time and distance and unimaginable heartache. So the Donner Party reaches the Sierra Nevada mountains, and most people don't know that the window of opportunity for them to cross the mountains closed 1 day earlier than they made it there from a freak late storm blizzard. So there's a lot more I could say about the Donner Party, but they spent a harrowing winter surviving on shoe leather and blankets and bits of wood until finally they descended into depravity and dove into cannibalism. So it's a hard story. It's a very hard story to tell and to read, but there's a lot of grit and determination and persistence and resilience. And half of the 88 members, well, actually 46 of them survived, 42 of them perished. So it's a sobering story, but those who survived kept the long view in mind and did what they had to do to survive. I don't think I could have done it, by the way. And that's a hard truth that I had to confront when I was writing this book.
Yeah, it's fascinating to consider how these hardships continue in the DNA of their family members going on. A topic for another day, maybe. Let's turn to Myra now.
Yeah. So speaking of intergenerational epigenetic trauma, so some of the things that I discovered about resilience, writing the book and finding my dad's manuscript is it's interesting, Shelley, because when you were hearing you read that those paragraphs aloud, I heard things I hadn't heard before. And when we talk about how the turtle kept coming back into its shell, that was its protection, coming back into itself. And my dad, throughout his whole childhood, which was actually traumatic even before the war and even before the Holocaust, my dad retreated into daydreams and into his imagination. And when people say to him, "How did you survive the Holocaust?" he always said visualization, that he could go somewhere else in his imagination. So to me, that was him retreating into himself and almost refueling and being able to have an experience that was less horrific. So he somehow had the ability to keep going. The other things that I learned through this process was how much help my dad had to survive. I mean, both people who risked their lives to help him during the war, but also afterwards, the cousin in America who brought him here, who supported him and my aunt, the two people to survive from their immediate family, had lived with my father's cousin in a little teeny 1-bedroom apartment with our whole family, with kids sleeping in the hallway for years and years and years. And it made me think too about the woman in the Sudan who risked her own safety to swerve and avoid the turtle versus the man in the pickup who made it a sport to try and kill the turtle. And I just think that my father's life, you see the worst, some of the worst you've seen of humanity, what the Nazi party did to killing 6 million Jews and torturing millions more. And then you also see people sacrificing themselves and living from their heart and saving people's lives. And part of, I think, resilience is learning how to navigate this world that has so much of both. And the last thing about resilience, which I had, so my father was raised Hasidic, very, very Orthodox, very strict in Poland, and most of his family that survived, a small percentage that survived, stayed very religious. And I was raised not knowing them. And so during this process, I thought my whole family was pretty much wiped out except for a handful. During this process of researching the book, I met cousin after cousin, and I found out that I have about 400 relatives living that descend from the same little small town in Poland. So to me, that's also resilience, that this community that was basically completely destroyed, now we're 400 strong, and we're working on a family tree to preserve this information. There's only 2 people alive that lived through the Holocaust. Everyone else, family.
That's amazing, Myra. Let's turn to question number 3. And it's something that Kat Harper brought up in our chat. Basically, in the current state of the world, the pandemic and political and human rights struggles and fights, what are you thinking is an interesting element of the role of resilience or grit? And I'll say just one thing. We were talking about this yesterday, the 4 of us, and in a very minor way, one thing I've noticed as a college instructor at a university where a very large portion of our student population are first-generation college students, at the beginning of the semester, I sometimes worry about those students the most. They don't have a model for what it looks like to succeed in college. And I think it's going to be so much more straightforward for the students whose parents went to college. And yet, semester after semester, I have students who are farm workers themselves, and their parents did not go to high school, much less to college, and they last. They make it through the semester because they know what it is to tough it out. And yet at the same time, I can't help wondering, is it right that we always ask them to tough it out? So I'll step out here and say, Myra, it's your turn to go first.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think during, my book talks so much about World War II. my life, I'm 56, has been so privileged, and I haven't lived through what my parents have lived through, what a lot of people from older generations have lived through, and it's interesting. I think that this pandemic is shining a spotlight on the inequities that are going on in this country, and it's also, I don't know. I think one of the pieces of wisdom that my father shared is how contagious thoughts are, how contagious beliefs are. And I find that it's very fascinating where we're at this time where we have this pandemic where, one of the biggest attributes of this virus is how contagious it is. It's not even that it's necessarily that as virulent as some other horrible diseases, but it is so contagious, and it doesn't differentiate between anyone in the human race. We are all the same. And I think seeing every country around the world grappling with the same issues really shows us how we are all really in this together, in this one planet that is overheating, that is over polluted. Now I think that we're seeing these issues of racial injustice in our country coming to the fore. And I just think it is a real opportunity for the human race to show our resilience by looking at this as an opportunity for some quick evolution and some quick awareness. I think when we think about issues like global warming, it's always theoretical. It's always in the future. When we thought about a pandemic, it was always theoretical. We didn't prepare for it. So I'm just hoping that as we are all together, we're connected like we are now through the internet. We can share ideas, we can share stories. And I think being writers, what we learn is that it is the individual stories that really touch people, that move people, that change people. Because you hear the word Holocaust, and it's a label. You don't know the stories of the 6 million people that were murdered. And then you hear one person's, you hear my dad's story. So I'm just hoping that we're all kind of waking up and finding the resilience within ourselves to adapt to a new world and kind of move forward in a more harmonious, intelligent way.
Thank you, Myra. Gretchen, let's turn to you now.
I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think for me, what settles out the most is that I'm just so incredibly moved by the people in our country and around the world who have the least, although it is a sort of equal opportunity virus, as Myra says, still those people who have the least are burdened with the most. Either their health conditions themselves put them more prone to the disease, or make the disease worse if they get it, or they are, terribly traumatized by loss of job, by loss of income, perhaps loss of housing, and if you add on that generational poverty and systems, it's really truly daunting for me to think about people. I take your comment, Shelley, in terms of your students with a little bit of hopefulness, that those of us who are beaten down more maybe have a little more grit to work with. I'm not sure, but I believe the story. But I also think that the stress level just must be enormous for families and individuals who have no resources, who are really burdened by health, economic, and crises of all those sorts. I also think some about from a macro system level, kind of the different governments and countries that are going through this, and how they are approaching this virus. And speaking in our country, if one of the things people need during a crisis like this is trustworthy information and personal advocates, then dishing out a lot of untrustworthy information is certainly no help to any of us, particularly those most in need of help. And so, it's interesting to sort of think about it from that point of view too. I'm just really struck, though, by the greatest burden that people have right now with all of this coming at once. And as Ashley referenced in the beginning, the turtle had 4 things coming at it, quickly in pursuit, and many families are dealing with 4 or 10, major challenges at the same time.
Thank you, Gretchen. And I think it bears noting that Steinbeck spent quite a bit of page space on people dealing with multiple crises at once.
Yeah.
Ashley.
Right.
Yes, I'm going to piggyback on that, Gretchen, that we need to judge our current situation not only through the minute-to-minute news feed, which I'm as guilty as anyone of, being a news junkie, but through the lens of history. It's not the first time that the United States has faced adversity collectively, war, famine, authoritarian regimes, national unrest, and now a pandemic. And all of us have been impacted in some way by COVID-19, some much more than others. We can't ignore the fact that we have 150,000 Americans dead of this disease, and other catastrophic impacts like loss of jobs and loss of homes and businesses, loss of health insurance, rise in domestic abuse, and disruption of education. I have 4 children and 3 in-law children, and of those, half of them are teachers, and so they're facing a big dilemma come September. So I'm not minimizing any of them, but what I've come to know, and not in an abstract way, is the resilience of human nature. And I think most of you may recall early in March, there was a viral video that went around about a man in Rome singing off of his balcony. And that struck me in such a profound way that I found myself weeping over it. And since that time, I'm buoyed by the world's creativity in the time of stress. We have virtual choirs and orchestral concerts. We have dancers and actors and athletes practicing and performing in alternate venues. We've got artists and musicians and writers creating works during this time. It's a time of collective grief, but it's also a time of collective resilience. And for the 4 of us being 2020 authors, publishing in the time of coronavirus has been very challenging. And I don't know how much the general population really knows about that, but all of us signed our contracts 2 years ago to publish our books this year. It takes 2 years to publish a book, unless perhaps you have some juicy information about someone in government. But otherwise, it takes a long time. And during that time, we've had to take a hard left turn and reimagine and rearrange our launch parties and our touring schedules and our conference schedules, like this conference here. So glad that it went virtual this year. But we've had to meet the challenges head on and deal with this new reality like everyone has in their own way. And I'm just going to close this off with a quote that the 19th century journalist Edwin Bryant says to my fictitious protagonist, Ada Weeks, in Answer Creek as they're visiting. And he says to her bluntly, "See the opportunity, not the obstacle."
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about our shared interest and expertise in grit and resilience. I also want to thank the conference for responding to crisis beautifully. And whether or not there are ups and downs with how to put it all together, I think this gathering of all of us, our willingness to gather online like this, demonstrates an essential resilience and hopefulness about connecting with other people. We cannot be in the same room, but we can be together. We can connect even through this 2-dimensional screen. So thank you very much for this opportunity.